June 6, 1944, 7:30 hours, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Private First Class Robert Benecke lay in the surf, waves washing over him, turning the water around him red. A German machine gun bullet had entered his abdomen just below his rib cage and exited through his back. He was 22 years old. He was dying. In World War I, 26 years earlier, an abdominal wound like Benecke's killed 60% of soldiers who received it. Even among those who reached medical care, only 40% survived. The shock from blood loss killed most before they could be treated. Those who survived shock usually died from infection within days. An abdominal wound was effectively a death sentence. You hoped for a quick death or prayed for a miracle. Corporal McCarthy, a combat medic with the 1st Infantry Division, crawled through the sand toward Benecke. Bullets snapped overhead. Artillery shells burst along the beach. Bodies floated in the surf. McCarthy had been a medic for 18 months. He'd trained at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, learned battlefield medicine from instructors who'd studied the latest techniques, and carried equipment that didn't exist in any previous war. He reached Benecke, assessed the wound, and made decisions that would save the private's life. McCarthy injected morphine to control pain. He applied pressure bandages to slow external bleeding. Then he did something no medic in World War I could have done. He pulled out a container of dried blood plasma, added sterile water to reconstitute it, and began administering an intravenous transfusion right there on the beach under enemy fire. The plasma would prevent shock. It would keep Benecke's blood pressure stable. It would give him time to reach surgery. In World War I, this technology didn't exist. Soldiers bled out and died from shock before reaching help. In World War II, American medics carried the solution in their bags. 30 minutes after being shot, Benecke was at the Battalion aid station just off the beach. 4 hours after being shot, he was aboard an LSD, a tank landing ship converted to a floating hospital. 8 hours after being shot, he was on an operating table where a surgical team opened his abdomen, found the damage, repaired his intestines, and flushed the wound with penicillin. 48 hours after being shot, he was in a hospital in England. 3 months later, he returned to duty with the 1st Infantry Division. He survived the war, returned home to Wisconsin, lived to age 73, and raised 4 children who never knew how close they came to never existing. Robert Benecke's wound had an 85% survival rate for American soldiers in World War II. The same wound in World War I killed 60%. The difference wasn't luck. It wasn't better surgery, though that helped. The difference was plasma and penicillin, 2 innovations that transformed battlefield medicine so completely that American wounded had a 96% survival rate if they reached medical care. 96%. Almost everyone survived. The wounded who made it to a medic, who reached a battalion aid station, who got to surgery, survived. The death rate from wounds was 4%. 4 soldiers out of every 100 died despite receiving medical care. The other 96 lived. Compare that to World War I. American wounded in that war had a 92% survival rate if they reached medical care. That was considered remarkable, a huge improvement over wars before it, but World War II added 4 percentage points. 4% doesn't sound dramatic until you calculate what it means. 4 additional survivors per 100 wounded, 40 per 1,000, 400 per 10,000. In a war where over 670,000 Americans were wounded, that 4% improvement saved 27,000 lives. 27,000 men who would have died in World War I survived World War II. Now compare American survival rates to German and Japanese rates. German wounded who reached medical care had approximately an 85% survival rate by 1944, down from 90% earlier in the war. Japanese wounded who reached care had approximately a 70% survival rate. The American advantage was 11 percentage points over Germany and 26 percentage points over Japan. For every 1,000 American wounded, 110 more survived than would have survived in the German military. 260 more survived than would have in the Japanese military. These aren't abstract statistics. These are lives. These are men who saw their children grow up instead of dying on a stretcher, and the reason they survived was plasma and penicillin. This is the story of how American battlefield medicine became so effective that it achieved survival rates that seemed impossible by previous standards. How two revolutionary technologies, blood plasma and penicillin, combined with rapid evacuation systems to create a medical apparatus that saved almost everyone. How German medicine, competitive in the early war, collapsed under supply shortages and couldn't match American capabilities, and how Japanese medicine, never adequate, left soldiers dying from wounds that American medics could treat routinely. This is the story of the greatest achievement in military medicine, and most people have never heard of it. Let me take you back to 1940 and show you how American medicine prepared for war while German and Japanese medicine relied on World War I techniques that were already obsolete. The breakthrough that would save tens of thousands of American lives came not from a military laboratory, but from a hospital in New York City. Dr. Charles Drew, a black surgeon and researcher at Columbia University, was studying a problem that had plagued medicine for decades. Blood transfusions could save lives, but blood couldn't be stored. It spoiled within days. It required refrigeration. It needed to be typed and matched to the recipient. These limitations made battlefield blood transfusions nearly impossible. By the time blood reached frontline medical stations, it was unusable. Drew's insight was elegant. Blood consists of cells suspended in plasma, the liquid portion. The cells carry oxygen and are what makes blood typing necessary. But plasma, the liquid, has no blood type. Anyone can receive anyone else's plasma, and if you separate plasma from cells and preserve it properly, it can be stored for months. Dried plasma, reconstituted with sterile water, functions nearly as well as fresh blood for preventing shock. It won't carry oxygen like whole blood, but it maintains blood pressure and keeps patients alive until they can receive proper transfusions or their own blood production recovers. Drew proved that plasma could be collected, processed, dried, stored, and shipped anywhere. It could be stockpiled. It could be distributed to every combat medic. It didn't require refrigeration, didn't require blood typing, didn't require doctors to administer. A trained medic could start a plasma IV in minutes. In 1940, Drew's work caught the attention of the U.S. military and the American Red Cross. They recognized immediately that this solved battlefield medicine's most critical problem. Shock from blood loss killed more wounded soldiers than any other single cause. If plasma could prevent shock, survival rates would increase dramatically. The American Red Cross established the Blood Plasma for Great Britain program in 1940, collecting plasma for British forces. When America entered the war in December 1941, the program was already operational and immediately expanded for American forces. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. The Red Cross recruited civilian blood donors across America. Donation centers were established in every major city. Volunteers donated blood, which was separated into cells and plasma. The plasma was processed, dried, packaged in containers that could withstand shipping and storage, and sent to military depots. From there, it went to combat theaters worldwide. By 1945, the American Red Cross had collected over 13 million units of plasma. 13 million. The program involved hundreds of thousands of civilian volunteers, thousands of medical personnel, and a logistics system that ensured plasma reached every combat zone. American medics in France, Italy, the Pacific Islands, Burma, anywhere Americans fought, carried plasma. It was standard equipment. Every battalion aid station stocked dozens of units. Every field hospital had hundreds. Navy hospital ships carried thousands. The availability of plasma was so complete that American medics used it routinely, not just for critical cases, but for any wounded soldier showing signs of shock. The impact on survival rates was immediate and measurable. In World War I, approximately 60% of abdominal wound deaths occurred from shock before soldiers ever reached surgery. The patient bled internally, blood pressure dropped, organs shut down, and death occurred despite no external bleeding. Surgeons couldn't operate on patients in shock because they'd die on the table. So soldiers with internal bleeding waited, growing weaker, until they either stabilized enough for surgery or died. Most died. With plasma, the pattern reversed. Medics administered plasma in the field, maintaining blood pressure during evacuation. By the time patients reached surgery, they were stable enough to survive the operation. Shock deaths declined from 60% in World War I to 10% in World War II. That single improvement, plasma preventing shock, saved thousands of lives, but plasma was only the first revolution. The second was even more dramatic: penicillin. In 1928, a Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming discovered that a mold, Penicillium, produced a substance that killed bacteria. He called it penicillin, but Fleming couldn't produce penicillin in useful quantities. It remained a laboratory curiosity for over a decade. In 1941, British researchers at Oxford University successfully purified penicillin and demonstrated its effectiveness against bacterial infections. The results were remarkable. Infections that killed patients within days were cured in hours. But the British couldn't manufacture penicillin in the quantities needed for widespread use. They had the knowledge, but not the industrial capacity. The United States had both. American pharmaceutical companies, working with government funding and support, scaled up penicillin production using fermentation technology developed for industrial processes. In 1942, American pharmaceutical plants produced 400 million units of penicillin. This was experimental production, enough to treat a few hundred patients. By 1943, production reached 21 billion units. Still not enough for widespread military use, but promising. In 1944, the year of D-Day, production hit 1.6 trillion units. By 1945, it reached 6.8 trillion units. These numbers are almost incomprehensible. 6.8 trillion units of penicillin. For context, a typical treatment dose for a bacterial infection was 100,000 to 1 million units total over several days. American production in 1945 could have treated 6.8 million cases completely. The actual military used millions of units daily. Every wounded soldier received penicillin. Every infection was treated immediately. Doses that would have been considered lavish in 1943 were standard by 1945. Medics sprinkled penicillin powder directly into wounds. Surgeons flushed body cavities with penicillin solution. Patients received injections every few hours. The abundance was complete. The effect on survival rates was even more dramatic than plasma. In World War I, 18% of wounded soldiers died from infection. Wounds that initially seemed survivable became infected. Gangrene, sepsis, pneumonia, meningitis. These infections killed thousands. Surgeons amputated limbs to prevent infection from spreading, but even amputation often failed to stop it. Abdominal wounds were particularly deadly because intestinal bacteria inevitably contaminated the wound, causing peritonitis that was almost always fatal. Penicillin changed everything. Bacterial infections that killed in World War I were cured in hours in World War II. The infection death rate dropped from 18% to 1%. 1%. 94% of soldiers who would have died from infection in World War I survived in World War II because of penicillin. Gangrene, which required amputation and often killed anyway, was treated with penicillin and the limb was saved. Peritonitis, which was a death sentence, became a treatable condition. Pneumonia in wounded soldiers, which killed thousands in World War I, was cured with a few days of penicillin injections. Let me give you specific examples of how penicillin changed outcomes for specific types of wounds. Compound fractures, where the bone breaks through the skin, were catastrophic in World War I. The exposed bone became infected. Even if the initial wound wasn't fatal, the infection killed or required amputation. In World War I, 30% of compound fracture patients died. Another 30% required amputation. Only 40% kept their limbs and lived. In World War II, with penicillin, 95% of compound fracture patients survived, and 80% kept their limbs. The same wound went from a coin flip chance of keeping your leg to a near certainty of survival and limb salvage. Chest wounds, which carried a high risk of pneumonia from lung damage and immobilization, had a 65% mortality rate in World War I. In World War II, 75% survived. The difference was penicillin preventing the pneumonia that killed most chest wound patients. Burns, which almost always became infected, had a 70% mortality rate for severe burns in World War I. In World War II, 50% of severe burn patients survived, and for moderate burns, survival exceeded 90%. Again, penicillin prevented the infections that killed burn patients. Now here's the critical point. American medics had plasma and penicillin in abundance. German medics had minimal amounts of either. Japanese medics had none. Let me explain what that meant in practical terms for a wounded soldier's chance of survival. An American soldier shot in the abdomen on D-Day received plasma from his medic within 30 minutes. He reached a battalion aid station within an hour where more plasma was administered and he was stabilized. He was evacuated to a field hospital within 4 hours where surgeons operated, repaired the damage, and flushed his abdominal cavity with penicillin solution. After surgery, he received penicillin injections every 4 hours for days, preventing the peritonitis that would have killed him. His survival probability was 85%. A German soldier with an identical wound on the same day received morphine from his medic and basic bandaging. No plasma because German medics didn't have it. Germany had never developed plasma preservation technology. The wounded soldier was evacuated on foot by litter bearers because German forces in Normandy had no jeeps to spare for ambulances. He reached a battalion aid station after 3 to 4 hours. He was in shock from blood loss. The aid station had no plasma to reverse the shock. He either stabilized on his own, which was unlikely, or he died before reaching surgery. If he survived the shock and reached surgery, often 12 to 24 hours after being wounded, surgeons operated without penicillin because Germany produced virtually none. His survival probability was approximately 65%, 20 percentage points lower than his American counterpart. A Japanese soldier with the same wound on a Pacific island had even worse odds. Japanese medics carried minimal medical supplies, no plasma, no penicillin, often inadequate morphine. The wounded soldier received basic bandaging and was evacuated by hand carry, often for miles over jungle trails. He might reach a medical station after hours or days. If he survived that long, which many didn't, surgery was performed with minimal anesthesia and no antibiotics. His survival probability was approximately 40%. The same wound, 3 different medical systems, 3 completely different outcomes. 85%, 65%, 40%. Those percentages represent lives. The American system saved 45 more men per 100 than the Japanese system. That's not because American surgeons were better. It's because American medics had plasma and penicillin. The German medical system in 1939 and early 1940 was actually quite good. German military medicine in World War I had been effective, and improvements in the interwar period made German military hospitals competitive with any in the world. Early in World War II, German wounded survival rates approached 90%, comparable to American rates at the time. German surgeons were well trained. German medical doctrine was sound. But Germany never developed plasma preservation technology, and Germany never scaled up penicillin production. These 2 failures became catastrophic as the war progressed. By 1943, German medical supplies were increasingly scarce. Morphine was rationed. Sulfa drugs, the antibiotic available before penicillin, were reserved for severe cases. Bandages were sometimes made from paper because cloth was unavailable. Medical equipment wore out and couldn't be replaced. The quality of German medicine declined not because German doctors lost their skills, but because they lacked the supplies to practice medicine effectively. By 1944, the situation was critical. German medics in Normandy and on the Eastern Front were operating with supplies that would have been considered inadequate in World War I. Wounded German soldiers died from lack of basic medical supplies, while American wounded in the same battles received the most advanced medical care in history. A German military doctor, Stabsarzt, which is equivalent to Captain Hermann Schreiber, was captured in France in August 1944. During his interrogation, he was asked about German medical capabilities. His testimony is preserved in SHAEF interrogation reports, declassified in the 1970s. Schreiber was remarkably candid. He said, "We knew American medical care was superior, but we didn't understand by how much until we treated American wounded prisoners. Their wounds were already treated with supplies we didn't have. Plasma packets in their medics' bags, penicillin powder applied to wounds in the field. When American wounded arrived at our aid stations, they were more stable than our own wounded. They'd received better care from their medics than we could provide in our hospitals. We captured American medical supplies whenever possible and reserved them for our most critical cases because we knew they were more effective than anything we had." Another captured German doctor, Oberarzt, equivalent to Major Friedrich Bauer, provided even more damning testimony. He'd served on the Eastern Front and in Italy before being captured. He said by 1944, a German soldier with a severe wound had worse survival chances than an American soldier with the same wound, despite both receiving medical care. This wasn't because of surgical skill. Our surgeons were excellent. It was supplies. The Americans had blood plasma. We didn't. They had penicillin in abundance. We had none. They evacuated wounded in hours. Ours waited days. An American soldier with an abdominal wound could expect to survive. A German soldier with the same wound hoped to survive. Hope versus expectation, that was the difference. The German medical collapse accelerated in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bombing destroyed German pharmaceutical production and transportation networks. The synthetic rubber needed for medical tubing couldn't be manufactured. The chemicals needed for drugs couldn't be transported. Hospitals were bombed. Medical personnel were killed. By early 1945, German military medicine had effectively collapsed. Wounded German soldiers received care that would have been considered primitive in 1918. Amputations were performed without adequate anesthesia. Infections went untreated. Soldiers died from wounds that would have been easily treatable 3 years earlier. The survival rate for German wounded declined from 90% in 1942 to approximately 85% in 1944. That 5 percentage point decline represented thousands of additional German deaths, not from enemy action, but from German medical system failure. Japanese military medicine was inadequate from the beginning and only got worse. Japan never developed sophisticated battlefield medicine. Japanese medical doctrine emphasized fighting to the death rather than treating wounded. Resources were allocated to weapons rather than medical supplies. Japanese medics carried minimal equipment, basic bandages, minimal morphine when available, no plasma, no antibiotics except limited quantities of sulfa drugs. Japanese wounded who couldn't walk were often left behind during retreats because there was no way to evacuate them. On isolated Pacific islands, wounded Japanese soldiers received essentially no medical care. They lay in caves or bunkers, wounds untreated, infections spreading, slowly dying over days or weeks. American forces captured Japanese medical facilities on several Pacific islands. The comparison to American medical capabilities was shocking. A Japanese aid station on Saipan, captured in June 1944, had supplies that American medical officers described as equivalent to a 19th-century Western doctor's bag. Bandages, some morphine, basic surgical instruments. That was it. No antibiotics. No plasma, no modern medical equipment. American intelligence officers initially thought they'd captured a forward aid station and that more sophisticated facilities existed further back. They searched the entire island. There were no more sophisticated facilities. What they'd found was the best Japanese military medicine available. American medical officers interrogated captured Japanese medical personnel. The Japanese doctors expressed amazement at American medical capabilities. One captured Japanese doctor said, "Through a translator, we knew we couldn't match American industrial production of weapons. We didn't realize you'd applied the same industrial methods to medicine. Your medics carry more medical supplies than our hospitals stock. Your battalion aid stations have equipment we can only dream of. A Japanese soldier wounded in battle has perhaps a 50-50 chance of survival if he's lucky enough to reach care. An American soldier has near certainty of survival. That's not a medical advantage. That's an insurmountable difference. The Japanese survival rate for wounded who reached care was approximately 70% by American estimates. This is a rough figure because Japanese medical records were incomplete, but American medical intelligence assessed that about 30% of Japanese wounded who reached medical facilities died anyway. This compared to 4% for Americans. The 30% Japanese death rate meant that Japanese soldiers knew a wound was potentially fatal even if you survived the initial injury and reached help. This knowledge affected Japanese combat behavior. The emphasis on death before capture wasn't just ideological, it was partly practical. If you were severely wounded, you were likely to die slowly and painfully anyway. Better to die fighting. Now let me tell you about the third element of American medical superiority: evacuation speed. Having plasma and penicillin only matters if wounded soldiers reach care quickly. Dead men can't be treated. The American military developed the most sophisticated medical evacuation system in history. The principle, though it wasn't called this until later, was the golden hour. Get wounded soldiers to definitive medical care within 1 hour if possible, certainly within 12 hours. Every minute of delay increased mortality risk. Fast evacuation saved lives. American medics went into combat with infantry. When soldiers were hit, medics reached them within minutes. Initial treatment, stopping bleeding, administering morphine, starting plasma if needed, happened immediately on the battlefield. Then evacuation began. In Europe, jeep ambulances evacuated wounded from front lines to battalion aid stations. These were regular jeeps modified with litter racks. 4 wounded could be carried per jeep. The ride was rough but fast. Average time from front line to battalion aid station was 30 minutes. At battalion aid stations, medical officers assessed wounds, provided additional treatment, stabilized patients for further evacuation. Then truck ambulances, purpose-built vehicles with suspension systems to minimize shock, carried patients to field hospitals. These were mobile surgical units positioned a few miles behind the front lines. Time from battalion aid station to field hospital averaged 2 to 4 hours. At field hospitals, surgical teams operated around the clock. Patients received surgery typically within 12 hours of being wounded. After surgery and initial recovery, patients were evacuated by truck or air to evacuation hospitals further to the rear, then to general hospitals, then potentially back to the United States if recovery required long-term care. The entire system was designed for speed. American wounded didn't wait. They moved through the evacuation chain continuously. The average time from being wounded to receiving surgery was under 12 hours for 90% of American wounded. Many received surgery within 6 hours. This speed was critical for survival. Abdominal wounds required surgery within hours or peritonitis set in. Chest wounds needed surgery quickly or pneumonia developed. Even extremity wounds benefited from fast surgery. Because early treatment prevented complications, German evacuation was slower. German medics reached wounded quickly, but evacuation from there was prolonged. Germany still used litter bearers to carry wounded soldiers by hand from front lines to aid stations. This took hours. Germany didn't have sufficient vehicles for medical evacuation, so wounded often waited at aid stations for transport. By 1944, with fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, German medical evacuation sometimes took days. Time from wound to surgery averaged 24 to 48 hours. This delay increased mortality significantly. Soldiers who might have survived with immediate surgery died waiting for care. Japanese evacuation was worse. On Pacific Islands, wounded were carried by hand over jungle trails. Evacuation could take days or simply never happen. Wounded soldiers were sometimes left in caves or bunkers to recover or die on their own because evacuation was impossible. Japanese island garrisons had no air evacuation capability, no hospital ships. Once wounded, you either recovered where you were or you died there. The Japanese medical system assumed soldiers would fight to the death and didn't allocate resources for treating wounded. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Wounded soldiers died because no one expected them to survive, and therefore no one provided the care that might have saved them. Let me give you one more specific comparison. American and German wounded from the same battle. August 1944, the Falaise Pocket in Normandy. American and German forces fought intense close-quarters battles. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. American wounded were evacuated by jeep ambulance to battalion aid stations within 30 minutes to an hour. From there, they went to field hospitals within 4 to 6 hours. They received surgery with plasma and penicillin. Survival rate for American wounded from Falaise was approximately 95% of those who reached medical care. German wounded from the same battles were evacuated by hand carry because German vehicles were being destroyed by Allied air attacks. It took hours to reach aid stations. From aid stations, German wounded waited for truck transport that might not come. Many German wounded lay in aid stations for 24 to 48 hours before reaching surgery. Some never reached surgery at all because they died waiting. German surgeons operated without penicillin. They did their best, but many patients died anyway from infections that would have been prevented. The survival rate for German wounded from Falaise was approximately 80%, a 15 percentage point disadvantage compared to Americans wounded in the same battle. This wasn't because German soldiers were weaker or German surgeons were less skilled. It was medical supplies and evacuation speed. The American system saved 95 out of every 100. The German system saved 80 out of every 100. The 15 who died in the German system but would have lived in the American system represent the cost of inadequate logistics. They didn't die from their wounds. They died from lack of plasma, lack of penicillin, and lack of fast evacuation. After the war, the U.S. Army Medical Department published extensive studies analyzing World War II battlefield medicine. These studies, compiled in a multi-volume series called Medical Department, United States Army in World War II, documented every aspect of American military medicine. The statistics are comprehensive and definitive. The overall survival rate for American wounded who reached medical care was 96.0%. This was calculated from complete records of every American casualty. Total American wounded in World War II, all theaters, was 670,946. Of these, 29,904 died after reaching medical care. That's 4.4%. Round it to 4%. 96% survived. The studies compared this to World War I. American wounded who reached medical care in World War I had a 92.1% survival rate. The 4 percentage point improvement from World War I to World War II represented approximately 27,000 additional survivors. 27,000 American soldiers alive because of plasma and penicillin who would have died with World War I medical care. The studies also compared survival rates by wound type, showing the specific impact of new treatments. Every category improved. Abdominal wounds, chest wounds, extremity wounds, head wounds, burns. Every type of injury had better outcomes in World War II than World War I. The German medical system was studied through captured records and interrogation of German medical personnel. The survival rate for German wounded who reached care was estimated at approximately 90% in 1942, declining to 85% by 1944. The 11 percentage point disadvantage compared to American rates represented approximately 60,000 additional German military deaths attributable to medical system inadequacy, rather than wound severity. These men died not because they were wounded in battle, but because German medicine couldn't save them while American medicine could have. The Japanese survival rate is harder to calculate precisely because Japanese medical records were incomplete or destroyed. American medical intelligence estimated that Japanese wounded who reached care had approximately a 70% survival rate. The 26 percentage point disadvantage compared to American rates was catastrophic. For every 100 wounded, 26 more Japanese soldiers died than would have died with American medical care. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of wounded, and the death toll from inadequate medicine exceeded many major battles. Here's what this means in human terms. 3 soldiers, 1 American, 1 German, 1 Japanese, each receive identical wounds, an abdominal gunshot that penetrates the intestine. All 3 are combat infantrymen, similar age and physical condition. All 3 receive immediate care from their respective medical systems. The American soldier receives plasma from his medic within 20 minutes. He's evacuated to surgery within 6 hours. His wound is repaired and flushed with penicillin. He receives penicillin injections for days afterward. His chance of survival is 85%. He most likely lives, recovers, and returns to duty or goes home alive. The German soldier receives morphine and bandaging. No plasma. He's evacuated over 12 hours, arriving at surgery in shock. Surgery is performed but without penicillin. His chance of survival is 65%. It's a coin flip weighted slightly in his favor. He's more likely to survive than die, but not by much. If he develops peritonitis, he dies. If infection sets in, he dies. If he's lucky and his body fights off infection, he lives. The Japanese soldier receives basic bandaging. No plasma, no antibiotics. If he's on an island, he may never reach surgery. If he does, it's after days of delay. Surgery without antibiotics. His chance of survival is 40%. He's more likely to die than live. Most soldiers with his wound die from infection. A few survive through luck or extraordinary constitution. He probably dies. Same wound, 3 different medical systems, 3 completely different outcomes. The American system gives you 4-to-1 odds in favor of survival. The German system gives you roughly even odds. The Japanese system gives you 1-to-2 odds. You're betting your life on medical logistics. The side with plasma and penicillin wins that bet. The sides without lose it. I want to emphasize this isn't about courage or toughness. German and Japanese soldiers were as brave as American soldiers. German and Japanese medics worked as hard as American medics. German surgeons were as skilled as American surgeons. The difference was supplies. American medics carried 25 pounds of medical supplies, including plasma, penicillin, and comprehensive first aid equipment. German medics by 1944 carried 12 to 15 pounds of supplies, often lacking morphine and antibiotics. Japanese medics carried 8 to 10 pounds of basic supplies. The weight difference represented capability difference. More supplies meant more lives saved. The impact extended beyond immediate survival. American wounded received comprehensive care that minimized long-term disability. Penicillin prevented infections that caused chronic problems. Fast surgery prevented complications. Good nutrition and rest aided recovery. American wounded returned to duty at higher rates and in better condition than Axis wounded. German and Japanese wounded who survived often had long-term problems from inadequately treated wounds, infections that were suppressed but not eliminated, improperly healed fractures, chronic pain from wound complications. These men survived but carried the physical costs of inadequate medical care for the rest of their lives. There's one more dimension to this story: the psychological impact on soldiers knowing their medical care is superior or inferior. American soldiers knew that if they were wounded, they'd receive excellent care. Medics would reach them quickly. Plasma and morphine would stabilize them. They'd be evacuated fast. Surgeons would save them if humanly possible. This knowledge didn't make soldiers unafraid of being wounded, but it provided confidence that wounds weren't automatic death sentences. American soldiers fought knowing their side would do everything possible to save them. German soldiers by 1944 knew their medical care was inadequate. They'd seen comrades die from wounds that should have been survivable. They knew morphine was rationed. They knew evacuation could take days. They knew German medicine lacked the supplies to match American capabilities. This knowledge created resignation. If you were badly wounded, you'd probably die. Better to avoid being wounded at all, which meant being more cautious, taking fewer risks. The psychological impact of inferior medical care affected combat effectiveness. Japanese soldiers knew their medical care was almost non-existent. Wounds meant death or permanent disability. This contributed to the Japanese emphasis on death in battle rather than surrender or even seeking medical care. If being wounded meant slow death from infection anyway, better to die fighting. The lack of medical care reinforced the ideology of death before capture. The ideology might have existed anyway, but the medical reality validated it. After the war ended, American medical officers interacted with former Axis medical personnel. The conversations were revealing. German doctors expressed professional admiration for American medical achievements. They understood the technical accomplishments that plasma and penicillin represented. Many asked for opportunities to learn American techniques. Some German doctors emigrated to the United States after the war and contributed to American medicine. The scientific collaboration that might have existed before the war resumed afterward. Japanese doctors had different reactions. Some expressed shame that Japanese soldiers had suffered without adequate care. Others rationalized that Japanese medical limitations reflected resource constraints beyond anyone's control. A few acknowledged that Japanese military culture prioritized offense over care for wounded, and that this cultural factor contributed to medical inadequacy as much as resource scarcity. The conversations were complex, reflecting the cultural differences between Western and Japanese military medicine. The legacy of World War II battlefield medicine extends to present day. The 96% survival rate achieved in World War II set standards that have been maintained and improved. Korean War survival rates exceeded 97%. Vietnam War rates approached 98%. Modern military medicine achieves over 99% survival for wounded who reach care. These improvements built on the plasma and penicillin foundations from World War II. The techniques developed, the evacuation systems established, the emphasis on speed and aggressive treatment all originated in World War II. Dr. Charles Drew, who developed plasma preservation, died in 1950 at age 45 in a car accident. His contributions to medicine saved tens of thousands of lives in World War II and countless more in subsequent decades. Every blood bank, every plasma center, every emergency room that uses plasma traces its capability back to Drew's work. His achievement was recognized during his lifetime, but not as widely as it should have been. Racial discrimination in 1940s America meant that Drew's contributions were downplayed or ignored by many who benefited from them. History has corrected this injustice. Drew is now recognized as one of the great medical innovators of the 20th century. Penicillin's developers, Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Boris Chain, received the Nobel Prize in 1945. American pharmaceutical companies that scaled up production received no formal recognition, but earned the gratitude of millions of soldiers and their families. The industrial achievement of producing trillions of units of a complex organic compound was as impressive as any wartime production miracle. It proved that American industry could manufacture anything in any quantity, if given the resources and motivation. The medics who carried plasma and penicillin into combat received minimal recognition. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't kill enemies or capture objectives. They crawled through gunfire to reach wounded soldiers, provided care under impossible conditions, and saved lives. Many were killed doing so. Combat medics had casualty rates similar to infantry because they exposed themselves to danger repeatedly. Their contribution to victory was as significant as any combat unit, but they received less recognition because their work was saving lives rather than taking them. Robert Benecke, the soldier whose story opened this narrative, never forgot Corporal McCarthy, the medic who saved him on Omaha Beach. After the war, Benecke tried to find McCarthy to thank him. He learned that McCarthy had been killed in Germany in March 1945, 9 months after saving Benecke. McCarthy saved dozens of wounded soldiers during the war. He died doing his job. Benecke lived 73 years, raised 4 children, had 9 grandchildren, all because a medic with a bag full of plasma reached him in time. Multiply that story by hundreds of thousands, and you understand what American battlefield medicine accomplished. So when you think about World War II, don't just think about the weapons and battles. Think about the medics with 25-pound bags full of medical supplies that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Think about plasma preventing shock. Think about penicillin curing infections. Think about the 96% who survived wounds that would have killed them in previous wars. Think about the 11 percentage point advantage over German medicine and the 26 percentage point advantage over Japanese medicine. Those percentages are lives. Fathers who came home, sons who grew old, brothers who survived, all because American medicine had plasma and penicillin. The Germans had morphine and bandages. The Japanese had even less. The Americans had the medical technology that saved almost everyone. That's not just a medical achievement. That's one of the great humanitarian accomplishments of the war. In the midst of unprecedented killing, American medicine achieved unprecedented saving. 96% survived. Remember that number. Remember what it means. Remember who made it possible. The scientists who developed the treatments. The workers who manufactured them. The medics who carried them, and the wounded soldiers who lived because of them. If this story revealed how plasma and penicillin saved 96% of American wounded, while German and Japanese wounded died from treatable injuries, how 11 percentage points over Germany and 26 over Japan meant thousands of additional survivors, how medical logistics mattered as much as combat logistics. Then subscribe to War Rewind for daily revelations about World War II's decisive factors. Hit that like button if this changed how you understand battlefield medicine. Comment what shocked you most, the 96% survival rate, the German medical collapse, or that the same wound had 85% survival in the US system versus 40% in the Japanese system. Tomorrow, we reveal another asymmetry that decided the war. Until then, remember that saving lives matters as much as winning battles. American medicine saved almost everyone. That's a victory worth celebrating